I want you to talk about your experience on 9/11, and then what you did right after that, and then how you got involved with Ambassador Bremer and your work over there.
Okay. Well, I got involved with him first. I got involved with Ambassador Bremer long before 9/11. I came out of 4 years in El Salvador and was back in Washington, and I was in a job I didn't much like. And so at the United States Information Agency, where I worked at the time, and I said, you got to get me something better than this. This is an idiot job, and it's making me into an idiot. And a couple of days later, he said, well, Jerry Bremer is looking for someone in the Counterterrorism Office of the State Department to go over there and handle public affairs for him. So I went, we talked, and agreed that, yeah, we can do this. Then in some of the world's greatest timing, and you understand that public affairs in this context means I was going to write his speeches, and I was going to answer press inquiries and create publications and generally do things in an effort to build support for U.S. counterterrorism policies.
Mm-hmm.
So I agreed to that. I needed a week to disengage from my former position. And in that little interim, the Attorney General came out, announced that the National Security Advisor had resigned, Ollie North had been fired, and oh, by the way, we'd been trading arms for hostages. Very propitious. So
was this when Bremer was the
ambassador at large for counterterrorism?
Yeah, exactly.
So Jerry and I sat down and talked for a bit on my first day on the job, and what the hell are we? How do we explain this? And he's, that's it. It's an anomaly. And so that is, and then we made no attempt to go back and talk about what we had been saying. And we started reestablishing it, saying, with all sorts of, we had a series of basics, themes and speeches of, the pillars of counterterrorism, rule of law, firmness towards terrorists, work with like-minded countries, and I think there were 3, maybe 4 pillars of counterterrorism policy. And by the way, that those are still, or were for 20 years at least, maybe longer, the basis for U.S. counterterrorism policy. Firmness did not mean no negotiations, no deals. And when we would expand on that, it was a matter of no substantive concession. What's a substantive concession? A substantive confession leaves a terrorist better off than when he started. And so, yeah, and by the way, we're happy to talk to you. We'll talk to you. The theory was an operational theory, which worked pretty well up till 9/11, was time is on the side of the authorities, of the government. So you want to do everything you can do to string out any kind of an incident. We're thinking specifically, we had in mind Tehran and the diplomatic hostages, but hostage incidents around the world. And the working theory for most of the world's democracies was the terrorists are not in the business of trying to kill everyone they can find. They are, in effect, practicing tactical habits, or waging a kind of tactical exercise. Brian Michael Jenkins put it beautifully when he said, the terrorists have one finger on the trigger and one on the volume knob of the radio and the television, because they were trying to get into a position to create a political settlement, usually some sort of a recognition or compromise, and they wanted to use terrorism as a tactical exercise in how to start those negotiations. They did not want to kill people in wholesale quantities. They didn't want to do that because it would make people so mad that you could never have, it would stand in the way of the political settlement you were ultimately looking for. So that's that part of that background. Jerry came back to me later, some years later, actually, because I left there in 1990 and I'd gone off to Peru. I'd been in Mexico. In Peru, in particular, we had the singularly odd terrorists of the Shining Path.
Shining Path, yes.
And they weren't trying to negotiate anything. They intended a revolution straight up.
And that was a Maoist, a Marxist.
Yeah, they were Maoists, vaguely, but they were kind of idiosyncratic too.
Yeah.
And when I first got there, they said the only countries in the world they felt comfortable, the only country in the world they felt was really communist and really on the line with them was Albania. They'd turned their backs on almost everyone else. They carried out hugely violent attacks on almost anyone. Sometimes there was a thread of logic you could see and sometimes not. But they used mainly car bombs to do their violence, although they had varieties on all of that. And they were pretty doctrinaire and obscure, and in fact, not very sophisticated. I mean, they sort of announced themselves to the world when in Lima, people got up and going to work, and as they're driving along, there are all these dogs who are strung up from lampposts. And it took quite a while for a few scholars of communism to say, oh, that represents the running dogs of capitalism. But there was no additional message. And then they later started putting out political messages. But eventually they were laid low when I was there. It was in September of probably 92. Then I went on to Mexico, or I came back to Washington, then went to Mexico, and then I retiring and on my way out of the Foreign Service in late 99, 2000. And Jerry came in. I was back in the Counterterrorism office. And Jerry asked me if I would come over to the National Commission on Terrorism to do the same sort of message framing, speech writing, general drafting that I had done for him and for other people for other reasons. And the National Commission on Terrorism was a congressional body. It was not a creation of the executive branch. Congress created it, and they set it up as a bipartisan group to look at international terrorism.
It was a joint House and Senate committee, was it not? Or am I correct?
I think that is correct.
Yeah.
Yes, it was, because some of the members were appointed by senators. Bremer was the chair, and then it was a commission of 11. Bremer was the chair, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans. Invited to look at, where's the threat of terrorism now? What's happening? And the only thing that was outlawed or considered off limits had to be international. Congress did not want us discussing domestic terrorism. And this is, by now, we're past Oklahoma City, and they didn't want us prowling around in what brought about 9/11. So that's fine. We've had plenty to do. The commission was around 6 or 7 months. Very salty, seasoned, smart people. Former associate director of the FBI for counterterrorism, a former CIA director, international affairs staffer from the Senate, a serving member not a serving member, Jane Harmon from California.
Oh, yes.
Had run for the Senate, had failed to make it, and had not run for her old House seat, which she later took back. She was on there. And it was a smart and good bunch of people. I can't recall them all their names off the top of my head now, 20 years later, but it was a very impressive and serious group of people. Also, Washington experience. So the commissioners were quite serious. We want a brief report. If we do a 300-page report, no one will read it.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea was, it has to be under 100 pages, and let's just do minimal exposition and mostly focus on recommendations and why. It was essentially an executive summary, and unless memory fails, 69 recommendations of things we can do to protect ourselves against terrorism.
And this was the report that came out before 9/11.
Absolutely.
Right?
The report was issued in June of 2000. Oh, and let me tell you a couple of things about that report. I think there's been more than one print edition, but I'm pretty sure that one of them had a picture of the Twin Towers in the crosshairs of a rifle-type sight. And the National Commission on Terrorism was a congressional body. It was not a creation of the executive branch. Congress created it, and they set it up as a bipartisan group to look at international terrorism.
It was a joint House and Senate committee, was it not? Or am I correct?
I think that is correct.
Yeah.
Yes, it was, because some of the members were appointed by senators. Bremer was the chair, and then it was a commission of 11. Bremer was the chair, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans. Invited to look at, where's the threat of terrorism now? What's happening? And the only thing that was outlawed or considered off limits had to be international. Congress did not want us discussing domestic terrorism. And this is, by now, we're past Oklahoma City, and they didn't want us prowling around in what brought about 9/11. So that's fine. We've got plenty to do. Commission was around 6 or 7 months. Very salty, seasoned, smart people. Former associate director of the FBI for counterterrorism, a former CIA director, international affairs staffer from the Senate, a serving member not a serving member, Jane Harmon from California.
Oh, yes.
Had run for the Senate, failed to make it, and had not run for her old House seat, which she later took back. She was on there. And it was a smart and good bunch of people. I can't recall them all their names off the top of my head now, 20 years later, but it was a very impressive and serious group of people. Also Washington experience. So the commissioners were quite serious. We want a brief report. If we do a 300-page report, no one will read it.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea was, it has to be under 100 pages, and let's just do minimal exposition and mostly focus on recommendations and why. It was essentially an executive summary, and unless memory fails, 69 recommendations of things we can do to protect ourselves against terrorism.
And this was the report that came out before 9/11.
Absolutely.
Right?
The report was issued in June of 2000. Yeah. Oh, and let me tell you a couple of things about that report. I think there's been more than one print edition, but I am pretty sure that one of them had a picture of the Twin Towers in the crosshairs of a rifle type sight.
I recall those images.
Yeah, and then additionally, there were very specific recommendations. Let's keep track of people who are, Jane Harmon insisted that there be a recommendation there to keep track of foreigners in the United States on student visas.
Mm-hmm.
There was discussion of, there were recommendations that chemical weapons people came in to talk about biological warfare. And the experts who spoke on that were very clear. Said, with chemical weapons, the process is the weapon. That is, you don't control, biological. You can't control biological weapons by through access to materials. It's the know-how. So people can order this and that lab component, but the smart guys about biological warfare said, there are 15 or 20 people who, if they disappeared and suddenly popped up in another place, would scare hell out of me. So that was one of the recommendations. There was discussion explicitly of the CIA, of the CIA's recruitment guidelines that had been put in place by John Deutsch. And the panel was and they said basically that, we don't want you to take onto the payroll or use as an asset people who have bad records on human rights, bad records on all kinds of things. Basically, if they're not.
Yeah, and ultimately a bad record on handling classified information as well.
Well, no, that was kind of a different thing. We're not talking about hiring people. Well, I'm trying to make a distinction between an asset and an intelligence officer.
Okay. I'm just saying that, Deutsch eventually, got in trouble for.
Deutsch, he may have gotten in trouble for something else. He by then had moved on and become Deputy Secretary of Defense. But he had left behind the clandestine service of the CIA guidelines on who they could try to call them recruit or pick up as an asset. Foreigners who, and if they had bad records on human rights, if they had maltreated women, if they'd done this and that and the other. Much of that was done transparently as a reaction to a series of incidents in Guatemala in the 70s or 80s, where someone who was an asset, a Guatemalan military officer was an asset of the CIA, was accused of, and probably did, kill a Guatemalan insurgent who, according to someone, there was a woman, her name was Jennifer Harbury, and she identified herself as the common law spouse of the man who was probably tortured, probably murdered by this Guatemalan officer who happened to be an asset of the CIA. And she brought all kinds of suits in the United States, etc. And somehow she found a judge in Texas who agreed that she had a common law marriage with this man who had never actually been in the United States. But anyway, this was very embarrassing for the CIA. I mean, you recruit people to spy for you who torture and murder people. And so they had put in place a series of very restrictive deadlines, or not deadlines, but guidelines for who could become an asset and who not. You had to refer it back to Washington and get explicit approval, et cetera, et cetera. The commission was unanimous that process be dropped. Jim Woolsey, the former CIA director, said, look, there are only two questions you should ask yourself about who you will use as an asset. Do they know anything? And will they try to find out anything you want to know? He said, put this in a different context. If you've got some senior Nazi operator, whatnot, and you find he's got something in his character that lets you get his hooks into him. He's got gambling debts. I don't know, he's a homosexual. Who cares?
Oh yeah, it's tradecraft 101.
And they know stuff and they'll tell it to you, good enough.
Yep.
That was his argument. I don't know if everyone bought every word of what he was saying, but he certainly the commission certainly said CIA should repeal and do away with the Deutsch guidelines.
That's interesting. Because
pardon?
I was in counterintelligence for 7 years, and I mean, those were the guidelines. I mean, we went by, the old school book. If you can find a way of any kind of leverage you can get on whoever you've tagged as an asset, or you want to have as an asset, you use it.
Yeah.
In the old days, it was just straightforward blackmail,
coercion of one kind or another.
Financial debts. Of course, back in the day, 50s and 60s, if you were a homosexual, they used that.
If in some countries and societies, I suppose it's still usable. Although, I mean, the commission would have said, yeah, use that. Okay, so you got that. And then any number of really sensible, doable ideas for how to protect the nation. There was discussion of the importance of contingency planning, so you know what you're going to do. And the what people said was, if you don't have a playbook or something, and then you get clobbered with it, you're emotional, the country's fired up, and you do something stupid. And the example they put forward was interning Japanese Americans during World War II. So if people had thought about that, as they should have, because the war with Japan was years in the making, people should have said, what happens if we have to go to war with Japan? Won't matter. And of course came the shock of Pearl Harbor. In fact, the intro to that report of that commission quoted a person whose name I do not remember about how a Pearl Harbor happens, a catastrophe. And it's not just the alarm that doesn't work. It's the alarm that no one responds to because it sends out so many false alarms, etc. So the commission worked hard. The report was published and sank without a splash. I mean, it just was cast upon the waters, and it was like a perfect Olympic diver. Whoosh!
Yeah.
No wake, no splash, no nothing. Perfectly clean entry into the bottom of the bureaucratic universe.
Like a lot of reports do, they just sat on a desk, on a shelf collecting dust. Like,
I don't think this one ever made it to the shelf.
Yeah, I've seen some like that too.
Yeah.
And then comes 9/11.
Yeah. Where was I at that point? I had retired. I was the deputy director of the Oklahoma City National Memorial for the Prevention of Terrorism. Every day I would go into my office, I'd look out the window, and I would see the Oklahoma City National Memorial, the 168 chairs representing those victims.
Which isn't very far from where I'm at right now. I have to ask you, did you know David Sid?
Sure, I knew him very well. He was on the board when I arrived. Yeah. When I became executive director, I appointed him my deputy.
Okay, and then he eventually became executive director.
Yes,
until the very end. I know David very well.
Yes, he's a wonderful man. Very smart.
And the worst thing that DHS did, in my opinion, was cut off that paltry $2.2 million for the MIPT and David's creation of the NCOP program, the NCOP on the street program. Sure. And it was $2.2 million a year. At the time, I wrote a scathing editorial because I looked at the Inspector General reports, GAO reports showing far much more money being wasted, abused, could be accounted for. And they want to cut a working $2.2 million program.
Yep, that did happen.
In fact, a rookie who had just gone through the school um, took his training based on a citizen's tip, which led to him discovering a pipe bomb making ring. They were making pipe bombs and selling them to gangs.
Yeah, I believe that. I don't recall that particular episode,
And,
but I'm sure it's true. David understood beautifully that there are about 750, 800,000 police, law enforcement personnel scattered across the country. And we've never figured out how to energize them to look for or have a place for them to send and report things that look like a little bit less like wife beating, a little bit more like terrorism.
Yeah.
I don't mean to minimize spousal abuse. I'm just saying that they see that.
It's an analogy. I understand.
Yeah. 50 times a month. And they see terrorism once every 50 years on their streets.
So when 9/11 happened, and taking that earlier, not long before report into consideration, did that raise eyebrows? I mean, did people remember the report and say, wow?
Only the people who wrote it. I mean,
pardon?
Almost no one remembered that report. And I mean, eventually, I seem to recall that most of the enumerated recommendations of the report were adopted in one form or another. I mean, somebody must have, or maybe the recommendations were so obvious that when people started actually thinking about terrorism, they said, let's do this and that and the other. Maybe we should keep an eye on people who are here on student visas, see what they're studying, see what they're doing, see if they're really students. That's really sort of very simple stuff, but that wasn't happening.
And in the mid 90s, I mean, as far back as, well, I would say between 93 to 96, maybe even to 97, I was amazed at just how little interest, let alone institutional knowledge, there was about Al-Qaeda, Islamism, political Islamism, and jihad. The FBI didn't even have any linguists.
Yeah.
Hardly anybody at the agency could speak Pashtun.
Yeah. Look at something terribly important was happening at the 90s, and we highlighted it in that report of the National Commission on Terrorism. Terrorism before 1990 was often, usually even, wrapped up in the Cold War, in sort of East-West issues. What Michael Jenkins pointed out for us, and I don't know whether he was the first to take note of it, that between 1990 and 2000, the number of incidents, terrorist incidents worldwide, plummeted. A little pipe bombs and Molotov cocktails and anti-gringo demonstrations around the world more or less dried up. I mean, the Soviet Union had sort of given a bad name to leftist causes. It always had, but lots of people who had fallen for it realized they had been duped after the wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved.
Yeah.
But that trend, but while those number of incidents were going down, the number of deaths was going straight up. It rose significantly during the 90s from fewer incidents. Ergo, more victims per incident. And this means that the old paradigm of Brian Michael Jenkins, that terrorists are modulating their violence in order to it's a tactic to move you towards a political end, was fading away. and had faded away. And of course, the proof of that little notion that, it seems where the trend's going, and the trend was going straight to the World Trade Centers.
Yeah, because the old leftist terrorist organizations, like the Baader Meinhof Gang, the Red Brigade, that was a whole different political ideology that they were espousing, and that, like you said, it went by the wayside as Islamism, the jihad Sharia component of it, was emerging.
That's right, absolutely. And it's very the hard thing. I mean, you can look at terrorist incidents through the 70s and 80s, and you can draw and you can kind of see what the effort was about and what they were hoping for and what they thought that terrorism might accomplish. To this day, as I look at 9/11, I'm not sure exactly what Al-Qaeda and the Islamists thought they were going to accomplish when they did that. I mean, I know they had an internal debate about the near enemy and the far enemy, and who are our enemies, and then there's the whole elaborate theory that by attacking the great Satan and the West, who were supporting or who were generally supportive of the status quo politics of the Arab world, that if they could get us out of the business, they could get those leaders out of the business. Well, that's all sort of grad school seminar stuff. What did they think the United States could or would do if attacked? I'm fairly sure, and I think there are enough statements out there that people who still follow this in minute detail can tell us about, but I think what they were believing was, they're going to do this and they're going to do that. I don't believe that they thought we would be involved in a war for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think they had some odder expectations. I think what they really, the one I like the best, the one I think is most likely to be true, is the audience for that event, because terrorism does need an audience. If nobody sees it, nobody knows about it, it may be a lot of things, but it's not terrorist.
And it doesn't have the effect it's intended.
Absent an audience, there's no effect. But I think the audience was not the United States, wasn't Israel, wasn't Egypt. I think the audience was Muslims worldwide, and that it was to inspire them with the possibilities of what Muslims could do if they rose up against the polytheistic, imperialist, blah, blah, blah West. That's the only thing I've ever been able to make any sense of. And if I had to, but I wouldn't bet my pension that was correct either.
I've kind of come to that conclusion, as has others. I think it was more of an outreach, or lack of a better way of putting it, a recruiting tool, because they thought that there was enough true Islamists out there who did embrace jihad and had read all the hadiths, that it would just start radicalizing in larger and larger and larger numbers. And I think that was obviously
a perfect phrase, Tony.
A miscalculation on their part.
Yeah, it was a miscalculation on their part, but that it was a recruitment effort, I think, is absolutely true. And they did show us that there were more people willing to engage in that kind of sort of half-mad suicide terrorism than we had expected or thought there were before.
Yeah, because it did splinter off many splinter organizations.
But but all the changes they wanted came to nothing. the changes that, I mean, the worst things about 9/11, frankly, are the things we have done in response to it. In a way, it's a little bit like the committee said, or the commission, National Commission said, well, if you haven't figured out what you'll do, what will we do if, then you may wander off and do something stupid, which of course I think we did.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the greatest takeaway from 9/11, both the earlier report and then the final 9/11 Commission report? The biggest takeaways or the best things that of all the recommendations that were actually put into effect.
Well, I don't see. I see. Oh, it's been a long time since I read the 9/11 report. I remember I generally agreed with the things they were saying. I do not believe we needed a Department of Homeland Security. I think that just put, not that federal law enforcement is splendidly organized, but I don't think we needed a DHS. But there is there was an awareness that there were people out there in the world who don't like us for reasons we'll never fully penetrate.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are willing to kill us and do anything they can to make our lives miserable because of it. 9/11 demonstrated to us how little we know of the world. Of all of the Americans there are, how many were there on 9/11? 300 million, something like that. Mm-hmm. How many of them, not Muslims, knew that there were Sunnis and Shia? Never mind many of the more refined parts of understanding Islam.
Or they don't. No one ever explains what the difference is between the Sunnis and the Shias, or the individual sects within each group. They have their little each one has their little tribal. Their many disputes over things. They're not a cohesive, one big cohesive organization.
Well, how cohesive are we? And I say that from a perspective that goes back way before January 6th and way before a lot of other things. I spent more than half of my adult life living outside the United States in other cultures and trying to understand them. And understanding someone else's society, wow. If you haven't grown up there, even if you have the language, my Spanish used to be pretty good, and I'm good enough to be, interviewed on TV or things like that. But trying to I remember being in Mexico, which is a country which by world standards is pretty accessible. That is, if you want to read a history of Mexico or books about the history of Mexico, there are tens of thousands of volumes available. Paraguay? I don't know if I could carry them all. But Paraguay has its own confusing and contradictory history. And so, of course, we didn't know anything about what was going on in the Arab world, in Iraq and Afghanistan, anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I kind of picked up the classic comic books version, but no, I can't say I'm an expert on any of those things. And I lived 4 years straight in Mexico, know a lot more about it than most Americans and a handful of Mexicans, but there are Mexican habits and practices that I don't know about. And if I know about them, I'm not sure I understand the logic or origin of them. Others, yes, but I mean, it's hard. There's a good column in the Washington Post, I think today, about someone who moved to the United States and how 9/11 taught them things about the United States they did not know. The individual, I believe, was born and raised in Iran. And he said, when we want to, there's a loss, when there's suffering in my old country, everyone dresses in black. Men in severe black clothes carry a coffin down the main street, and people behind them are screaming and tearing their hair and cutting themselves, maybe flailing themselves with chains. The United States had great cause for massive grief on 9/11 and didn't react anything like that.
Yeah.
We got quiet and hard. And I mean, sure, we had our sentimental movements, but the idea that we would send, he mentioned specifically the twin spires of light that went up where the towers had been, things like this. He said, boy, that's when I really started trying to understand started understanding Americans. And it changed us in a lot of ways. And of course, we did so many things that we should know better than to do them. We started out with a military response. And if you think about terrorism and a military response, the only time you need the military is when the people you're looking after, trying to catch, have too much firepower, too many people to be handled by law enforcement. Our first and best tool against terrorism remains the rule of law. You can think a lot about terrorism and origins and hotbeds and blah, 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 but everything a terrorist does is against the law.
Yeah.
And so how you can do that. And because that was so foreign and there were so many and they were so far away, we had to use the military in some ways. But what we forgot is, what exactly can you do to a terrorist or 100 terrorists with tanks, battleships, aircraft carriers, helicopters? Counterterrorism, actually anti-terrorist measures, fighting terrorists, is all about intelligence and law and prosecutions. And so we've now blundered we blundered terribly into the Guantanamo mess, where I think maybe soon, if COVID permits us, we might be able to do something with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but probably not. We spend per terrorist of the few remaining in Guantanamo, $20, $40, $60 million a year a person. Oh, yeah. And we don't have a way out of it, because I do not believe that we will reach a point where we can, by using a military tribunal, arrive at satisfactory administration of justice against any of the hardcore, nasty, despicable terrorists who are there in Guantanamo.
A good example are the 5 that were released in return for Sergeant Bergdahl, who was court-martialed, and now they're right back
in the saddle again.
Yeah, in fact, 2 of them sat across the negotiating table.
That make you mad? It should. And the reason that happened was because we did not do what we know how to do, and what we do better than most, but not as well as we should, which is to administer the criminal justice program. And then Congress went off to I don't know what kind of whipped up fury sometime 10 years or more ago and said, you can't bring any of those prisoners into the United States. Well, I'm sorry. We've got people who are dreadfully dangerous that we have locked up in our maximum security prisons. I mean, our supermax prisons.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, if we had just marched ahead with what we had, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed could be rotting away in a basement in Colorado, and I'd be fine with that. Now, but the real hard part that we never really thought our way through was, well, what if we use methods to interrogate him that would not permit anything to happen in our criminal justice system? Well, guess what?
Mm-hmm.
We tortured people. And I'm not going to dance around the heads of pins and talk about what's the favored enhanced interrogation, because that's just, it was torture with a couple of limits here and there. But we tortured people. So once again, we didn't go with what we did best. When we had those guys, and I genuinely and truly appreciate the pressures of, we got to know if they're getting somewhere nuclear, if they're getting somewhere with true WMD. We have to know it now.
Are we better off post 9/11? Are we still in that, what they used to call the new normal, which, I mean, today it seems like we're in post 9/11 new normal, post COVID new normal? Have we learned anything that, be it a mass fatality, mass casualty incident, far worse than a pandemic, that we're ready for it? And one of the recommendations of the commission was, you know, again, they have too many committees overseeing DHS, and there's also too many vacancies historically, too many acting undersecretaries. And if the position's vacant, they simply call it the person performing the official duties of the undersecretary of whatever it is.
Yeah, they can't give them the acting title because of various statutes, etc.
Yeah, and those, when they have that non-official title, they're not getting the actual pay for it. Some are staying on, and there's interesting reasons why. That's another show, but it's also been rated repeatedly as one of the federal agencies with the lowest morale level.
Of course. I mean, their mission is scattered from hell to breakfast. Some of the people are almost at odds with each other. By definition, almost at odds with each other.
That's true.
I mean, people used to talk about the inherent contradictions of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which had the dual missions of keeping immigrants out of illegal immigrants out of the United States, while regularizing the immigration of people and encouraging citizenship. And, those two pieces didn't exactly fit well together. But what's different about now to my mind, from 2001, and it's been a problem that probably antedates it, we've lost a lot of competence in government. My recommendation for the nation is calm down. Think about what you have to do, what you need to do, what you should do, and trim it down to a scale where it can be done. Reduce but reduce the number of stakeholders, the number of people who have a voice in setting the policy, and just say, look, we got to have this. I mean, right now, and then there is a kind of, Michael Kinsley used to say that there is I want to get this right because I think it's important. The scandals in Washington are not about what's illegal. There's always enough of that, and it always goes on. But the real scandal is what's legal. But I mean, we just need to calm down, figure out what we know how to do, and the structural problems are very severe. At one point, I worked for the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and the first drug czar, Bill Bennett, was given statutory authority to examine and recommend what should be done with federal law enforcement. And he chose not to do, after he got some careful briefings about the politics of it, he said, no, we'll win the war on drugs before we can reform federal law enforcement. I mean, one of the problems was, and you hinted at it in your discussion of DHS, every one of the parts of federal law enforcement that's out there belongs to some committee of Congress. And in the Senate, one committee might own 3 or 4 or 5 federal law enforcement agencies, and they're parceled out to subcommittees, which have their chairman, etc. And if you consolidate DEA and alcohol, tobacco, firearms, explosives, and the FBI into a single agency, there are a lot fewer people who get to boss things around. And that's essentially the only, aside from some history and traditions that people who are there want to protect, that's the only reason not to do that. Because some of the chiefs would have to become Indians.
Exactly.
No.
Don, you've taken plenty of time with me. I really appreciate it. It's been insightful on many different levels. I guess the last thing I would ask is what if you had to make a experiential over the horizon judgment or look, what would it be in the next 5-10 years?
We would go back to, with our worst outcome is that you have 10 or 12 or 15 organizations and individuals going on a Timothy McVeigh tear. I mean, that's, the only good thing that came out of Timothy McVeigh's action was he gave an absolutely stinking reputation to armed, militant, violent, the right fringe in America. People saw what happened when that line of activity and belief was carried to its logical extreme. And Southern Poverty Law Center and other groups who followed that sort of thing really can tell you that the number and size and impact of the right fringe in America contracted for some years after the Oklahoma City bombing. That's ended now. And that's the way it is. I mean, certainly when the National Commission on Terrorism, of which I've spoken kindly many times, that's one of the reasons that Congress wanted to make it very clear that the mandate stopped at the water's edge. Nothing to do with terrorism by Americans in America. And
Mhm.
that's what we've got to look out for, because we're on a path that could take us there for the first time in a long, long time.
I see that too. I won't get into naming particular organizations or conspiracy theories or names, but they're growing astronomically.
Mhm.
I've actually had personal encounters with true believers who have been longtime friends who I thought were capable of cognitive, rational thinking, reasoning, and deduction. And some have gone off the deep end who have doctorates, and it baffles me.
Yeah. I mean, part of it, I think I understand, Tony, in the sense that I rattled off a bunch of sort of randomly thought through things that are not working in our political system today. And there are plenty of them out there. And there are plenty of people who have said, this process we have come to have is not capable of healing itself. I disagree, but once you reach that conclusion, you can jump off to a bunch of very scary places, and some of them are. And then I heard something about, what is it that that happens to some people when they get to the place you're talking about, the sort of well-educated, thoughtful people who've just lost their way. And it's because they, and this particular author, I don't remember who it was, theorized that, well, they know where they are, and they know what's happened. They know where they want to be. They know where we were, and they know where they'd like for us to be. And they're willing to let the middle be a black box where, okay, I can explain this. We started here, we ended up there, and if you want, you don't even listen to what they're saying. You don't really believe, listen, or care about what they're telling you brought us from point A to point B.
Mm-hmm.
They've already made that jump and letting other people say what they want. I know what I want, and I want to get there. And anyway, I'm not articulating that well. It's a very frustrating and difficult time. But multiple points of violence against constituted authority and ordinary people are the worst possible outcome for us, as they have been for our entire history.
Absolutely, and I do have a fear that I have synaptic, what do they call it? Semantic memory, pattern recognition, and not knowing what the pattern is necessarily, but seeing the dots and then start putting them together.
Mm-hmm.
I've been seeing this come about for a long time, and I fear that is in our future, and it probably sooner than later.
That's a sad enough point to end on.
It is. Don, you've been so gracious, and it's good seeing you and talking to you again, my friend. And you've got a standing invitation to be on anytime you want.
Thank you, sir.